give me the thumbs up.
I'd like to exchange this shekel. Is it getting too strong?
Okay. Good evening, everybody. One of the trademarks of BINA is we always start on time. So we'll start on time. So it's great to see you all here. I see some new faces, actually, which is great. For those who don't know, BINA, we have a lot of shiurim, a lot of classes in adult Jewish education. In fact, this is already set up for tomorrow morning where we have a big women's class. So a lot of different things going on. So it's great to have you. Tonight is the first of a three-part series, which is a rabbi meets professional. I'm not sure who's the rabbi and who's the professional here, and we're going to have to debate that. But the idea is to bring out a topic, a rabbi's perspective, which is the Torah perspective, and someone who's professional in it, who's very well versed in it on the ground. And tonight we have my father, Rabbi Gourarie, and Kevin Bermeister, who is extremely involved and instrumental and really is the one who is bringing out the Ir David, the city of David in Jerusalem. We're going to hear all about it. I think the underlying idea here, in the time when so many question our connection to Eretz Yisrael, our connection to the land of Israel, every part of the land of Israel, especially the part where Ir David is in, we have to show how we've always been there. We've been there for almost 4,000 years. So that's probably the underlying theme here tonight, and we're going to see that in a very, very clear way. So first we're going to hear from my father, a little bit about the Torah perspective behind this, and then we're going to hear from Kevin all about Ir David. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, Rabbi. And I'm not going to talk very long because we don't need a Torah perspective. The whole thing is Torah tonight. It's all Torah. So just want to say, first of all, big thank you to Kevin for taking the time. Thank you for my son Rabbi for organizing it. And just to reflect, so a number of weeks ago, I was in Israel, and for the second time, thanks to Kevin, I was treated to a deluxe tour of Ir David, which is amazing. And some of you know, because every time I come back, I'm on fire. And I spoke at Sidash Lashit, and I spoke at Shabbos. And the reason I'm on fire is because many, many reasons. But one of them is because when I was a child, and I'll just share this with you very quickly, and I'm going to give it over to Kevin because it's got a lot to share. When I was a child, one of the first things I learned after Chumash, when we started to learn Mishnah, was the Masechet Sukkot. It was the tractate in the Talmud that deals with the festival of Sukkot. And one of the things that deals with it is how the celebrations used to take place in the temple on Sukkot when they would draw the water. There was a special water libation that they would pour on the altar every day during the festival of Sukkot. And there was something called the Simchat Bet HaShoeva that they would celebrate the entire night in preparation for drawing the water. And I remember we learned this, we had a very good teacher, I remember it very, very clearly. And we learned that they would dance all night, we learned where it was, we learned about the gates in the temple, and then we learned that when it came dawn time, they would blow the trumpets, they would walk down to the Shiloach well, and they would draw the water. And we learned this many, many times, and it was clear in my mind, I still almost know the Mishnah by heart. And then many, many, many years later, it suddenly, from a Mishnah, just became alive. The first time I went to Ir David, I was standing at the Shiloach pool, and I could not believe that what I'd been learning all these years, I was right there. This is where it happened. I could picture it, and I looked up to the temple spot and just pictured the Kohanim and pictured everyone coming down to the Shiloach and then walking up again. It was just the most amazing experience. And then a few weeks ago, before I left to Israel, so the Shabbat before I left, I was davening here on the Shabbat morning, and I had the Haftarah. And it's the Haftarah that talks about the passing of King David. And it said at the end of the Haftarah that King David passed away, Vayikbor ato be'ir David, and they buried him in Ir David, which that kind of verse in Tanakh is a story. It's a story of many, many thousand years ago. Of course, everything in the Torah is alive, but it's a historic part of Torah. The difference was that when I read that pasuk, I knew that in a few days' time I'd be in Ir David. So we read the pasuk Vayikbor ato be'ir David, that they buried him in Ir David, and 3 days later I was there in Ir David. So it's just the most amazing experience. Anyone who goes to Israel, you have to visit Ir David, and it's just the most amazing thing that Kevin has dedicated so much resources and time and effort into the excavation that is ongoing there, that I'm sure we'll hear about. There's so many things about Tanakh and Jewish history and First Temple, Second Temple, that just really becomes alive and just shows our eternal connection, a deep historic connection, land of Israel. And of course, it's something that's further. I'll just end with this, because one of the things I saw there, besides the history, so that there are now people living in Ir David, families, right? And part of the tour guide actually took us into the actual Ir David section where people are living now. And there's a little kindergarten there, I think, and there were kids playing. And I'm thinking to myself, this is crazy. You actually have kids running around the streets where Yirmiyahu the prophet walked, King David walked, King Solomon walked, many of the prophets walked, many of the kings walked, and it's just the most, if you just stop to think about it, it's the most amazing thing. So we're very excited tonight to hear about what is actually going on in Ir David. Ir David is the original city of Jerusalem, King David's city. Over to Kevin. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see so many familiar faces here. I'm going to spend about 40 minutes talking. There's a couple of videos which I'm going to show you in the period of 40 minutes, and then I'll take questions and answers after that. Come in, please, everybody.
Come and sit to the front.
So, what I'm going to take you through is ancient Jerusalem, and I'm going to try and focus on really some of the archaeological discoveries that meet the biblical knowledge, the Tanakh, and even information that we have from Chumash as it relates to this site. And I'll try to point as we're going through how we make those connections. So the first thing that you're probably familiar with is the Kotel, the western wall, the last remaining wall of the Herodian temple, which was standing approximately 2,000 years ago and then destroyed by the Romans. The promenade, many of you you've been there or you know about it, but and behind here, looking east, is the Mount of Olives. Now, what I will show you here is this is where the Kotel is. That picture was taken here, the promenade, and we're looking at the Temple Mount, which is this rectangular shape over here. And the red dotted area that you see on the slide is actually the original city of Jerusalem before the Temple Mount existed, before there was a first temple, before there was a second temple. This is where the original city of Jerusalem is based. Now the blue star I'll come back to later on. You'll see it appearing on a few slides. It's just a positioning. There were a few discoveries in that area which we'll talk about. The red dots that you see around this mountain represents Mount Moriah. So you all know, you've heard of Mount Moriah. We have a school here, Moriah School. This is one single rock. Its topology is from the top to the bottom. There is a valley called the Kidron Valley, which is to the east of Mount Moriah. There's a valley to the west of Mount Moriah. And the only water source that is present in the mountain is here, emanating from a spring called the Gihon Spring. Okay, the water at this time, about 4,100, 4,200 years and prior, exited from the spring through the valley and then ran to about 8 kilometers to the Dead Sea, which of course is the lowest point on earth, and that's where the water of the Gihon Spring eventually ended up in this time frame. So the plateau of the mountain, which is the sort of top table section that you see over here, is a section that I'm going to talk about. Most populations in the period 4,000 years ago, roughly, were based around the water source, living in the valley area along the eastern slope of the mountain. And the populations that were there were very sparse. There's not a lot of people living in and around Jerusalem in that time frame. So we'll take a look now at three images. Roughly 1920 at the top here, roughly 1948, something like this, and of course the current day image of the city of David, the original Jerusalem. You can see these farming terraces that were built on top of that city of David. This is the Temple Mount at the top section of the mountain, the southern walls. Of course, that is where the Kotel is, the western wall. You can see here in 1920, thereabouts, there was very, very few people living there. It was really farmland. 1948, there were a few more houses, or prior to 1948, people living there. And of course, in 1948, there was a massive influx of Jordanian and Syrian, Lebanese, Arab population who came in and essentially started to occupy the mountain, as there was a threat that they were going to lose this area, and the Jews were coming back, and essentially this today became populated up until 1990 or thereabouts, almost entirely by Muslim Arab families, and the sort of radical fringe of Muslim Arab families, and until the modern founders of the city of David, or the ones who rediscovered the city of David and brought it back, came and moved their families in there in 1983, 84, 85, that kind of period of time. And for the first few years, really, when the wives needed to go shopping or bringing groceries back home, or taking kids out to school, there was an Uzi in the front and an Uzi in the back. And they lived like that for almost 10 years, 15 years, until they started to sort of tame the neighborhood, gentrify the neighborhood, push out the most radical fringes, buy their homes, and eventually, now today there are something like 120 Jewish families living on the mountain. These are two expeditions that were led on the mountain. The earliest here with pictures that we have is from 1910. There were expeditions in the late 1800s. But these are the two most prominent expeditions. Parker and Vincent. Parker raised money on the London Stock Exchange. The movie Indiana Jones is really after his character. He came here to find the Ark of the Covenant. And that was his main mission, and he really started to dig and excavate and go underground and try to find all the tunnel systems and the things that were remaining, not only here but also up on the Temple Mount. This is a cave that he found, which is on the eastern side of the mountain. It's certainly the oldest home in Jerusalem by far. Somewhere from about 4,000 years ago, this cave was carved into the side of the mountain. And you can see, this is a picture that I took here more recently, but this is Parker, and he had a helper called Vincent, who was a priest who was working in Jerusalem at the time, who basically documented the expedition. And then we have McAllister and Duncan in 25, who did extensive documentation. And one of the most interesting parts of their discoveries at the top of the mountain section, the plateau, that tabletop section that I was showing you in the red dots, is they discovered several tombs, grave sites. Now, what is very clear from their work and their excavations is that people were not living on the top of the mountain at that point in time. They were living down in the valley by the water source. They were burying their dead on the top of the mountain. And that's where the sacred tombs were, and that's where the pottery that you see over here from about 3,800 years ago, thereabouts, which is in the Rockefeller Museum today, was discovered. It's very, very fine pottery. It would have been, the latest cutting-edge technology for crockery, and in the time it was a full set that was buried with the people who were in this grave. Obviously, important people buried up on the top of the mountain. Now, the blue star that you've been seeing in a few of these images. At that point, the blue star, there were two particular seals called what we call bulla, discovered. Now, there were lots of seals, hundreds of seals, but these are some of the seals that have been discovered in and around the tabletop section. Where the blue star is essentially where King David's palace was eventually built around 3,000 years ago, somewhere in that time frame. So we've now jumped 1,000 years, from 4,000 years to 3,000 years ago. And the reason why it's important to understand what these seals are is that letters, these were the royal seals, only owned by the bureaucrats and the servants of the kings, the Jewish kings that were living in the now developed city of David, with the palace of King David. And these are royal seals that came after King David. So from about 2,800 years ago to 2,500 years ago, something along those lines. These seals were basically, a document was written by a scribe, rolled up like this over here. Some hessian was sort of tied around the document. Some clay was pushed onto the hessian, onto the document to seal its authenticity, and the signet ring of the officer or the servant who was sending the letter would be impressed into the clay, so that the recipient knew that this letter was authentic and in fact did come from the bureaucrat or the servant who of the king who was representing the king's orders. And so many of these have been found scattered around the mountain because people would be sending orders around the mountain with these letters all of the time. Workers on the mountain, things happening, excavations, stuff, building houses, all sorts of activities going on that people would be sent. Now, the most interesting pair of seals that have been discovered, for me was earth-shattering when I saw this, was from two people, Gedalia ben Pashchur and Michoel ben Shelemiah, and they were both mentioned in the same chapter 38 of Jeremiah 38 verse 1. So you have two seals that were discovered by Eilat Mazar, the archaeologist at the time, about 15 meters away from each other, 10-15 meters away from each other, in the same area of the Blue Star that you saw earlier on. And both of these seals were discovered about 5 years apart in the archaeological excavations that were being uncovered at the time. And you have two seals, two guys who are both in the same verse in Tanakh. Okay. Now these guys were generals of the last king of before the destruction of the first temple period and the destruction of Jerusalem, which is the Babylonian destruction. And Zedekiah, Tzidkiyahu, who was really the last king to prevail at that time, had sent these gods given these gods the authority that they had, and they came across this guy called Yirmiyahu. Okay, and who was Jeremiah? Jeremiah, for most of his life, had been prophesying about the impending destruction of Jerusalem. He had been warning people, standing on his soapbox, espousing to the crowds in the city of David all day long, never stopping, saying, if you don't change your ways, if you don't stop doing the things you're doing, if you don't change your behaviors and start following the mitzvot, start praying to Hashem the way it was supposed to be, Jerusalem would be destroyed. Now, Jeremiah came about 100 years after the first attempt by the Assyrians to destroy Jerusalem, and that was during the time under King Hezekiah. Okay, so Hezekiah, there was a failed attempt by the Assyrians, and then Jeremiah espouses that there will be another attempt by the Babylonians, and eventually these two guys, Gedalia and Michoel, get fed up with him, throw him in a pit. That's it. That's how they dealt with Jeremiah. And really, their actions of throwing him into a pit, a deep pit filled with mud, we have in Tanakh, we have so many lamentations, we have so much of the writings, the crying, the pleadings of Jeremiah, but really their actions of throwing him into jail in this pit probably saved his life, because what really happened is that he was down in the pit during the entire destruction of the city of Jerusalem, during the slaughtering of people, the killing of babies and families, the burning of the city, the destruction of so much that we now see in these destruction layers in the archaeology in the city. This is really, Jeremiah then was pulled up out of the pit by the Babylonians. He pleaded to stay in Jerusalem. He stayed in Jerusalem. We have this very rich history from these preserved seals that were hardened in the fire and the flames, whereas everything else burned. Now I'm going to take you to an image which is really back to about the time of, between the period of Hezekiah, okay, and until the time of Tzidkiyahu, Zedekiah, their destruction period. this is approximately, roughly what the city would have looked like. This is an artist impression. The walls may not have exactly looked like that. Some of the walls have been discovered, some of them have not been discovered. There's a lot of archaeological debate about whether or not things existed or not. But what clearly does exist is that there was a construction that took place by Hezekiah to move the water from the Gihon spring at the bottom, which was exiting originally to the valley floor, into the mountain through a channel, a tunnel system that moved the water to the Shiloach pool, which Rabbi talked about earlier on. And the Shiloach pool was the first time that the water was moved into the city, behind the city walls, through this very carefully graded tunnel system that was built from both sides. Now, that was really the first time that the way that water was moved into the city changed. So originally, before this tunnel was constructed, water was moved through this tunnel system that you see over here in orange. Now, that tunnel system was found by an archaeologist called Charles Warren in the 1870s, and it's called the Warren's shaft system. Okay, now, what we really now understand, and you'll see Ronnie Reich, who was the principal archaeologist at the time, will mention in a video that I'm about to show you what occurred in the Warren's shaft system. When Ronnie made the video, we actually now have more knowledge about this system than at the time that Ronnie made the video. But clearly, this was an industrial scale movement of water from a pool that was constructed to catch the water, to move the water up into a bottling plant. It was the world's first water bottling plant, and to carry the water through the mountain, through this tunnel system, and to hoist it up into the city in order to sustain the growing population at the tabletop section of the mountain, which was originally graves and grave sites and tombs, and progressively became increasingly more populated as this industrial scale water system started to move water up for the population needs in the top of the city. So these guys were carrying water in skins and bags and bottles and jugs, professional water carriers, moving water all day long, all night long, up into the city to take care of people's needs up in the city. It's about 50 meters, 634 meters above sea level at the Gihon Spring, 680 meters at the top. So it's about a 50-meter vertical rise at about 35-degree sort of slope. It's very, very hard to carry heavy water up that eastern slope. So this tunnel made an easier grade through the mountain. Now let me just get this started. This will start a video for us. And hopefully that'll get going. Sound may be a little bit quiet, so you'll just have to.
We are now on our way down the sloping tunnel cut in bedrock, the famous water system, which is called Warren shaft system. It is an underground tunnel which reaches finally the source of water of Old Jerusalem, ancient Jerusalem. So what we have to imagine here in ancient times is people going down with their empty store jars or buckets or water skins to the water, filling in water there and coming back on the other side of the steps with their containers full of water, and from here back to their homes in the city. It is done because outside is a foreign army who threatens the people of Jerusalem. But the supply of water is secured because we come to it in a secret way, this tunnel direct to the water. Nobody can prevent us of doing it. Let's go now in the path, in the way of the water carriers down to the source of water to bring water. I'm standing now inside what we call the pool. You can see it is cut in rock. It's a large cavity cut in bedrock. The corner of it down here reaches down a few more meters to a level which is below water level, the level of the water which emanates from the spring. Water was led to this place through what we call the Canaanite channel, or channel 2, we gave the numbers. And people reached the place from above, from the city, through the tunnel which Warren discovered. They didn't stop at Warren's shaft, which was not seen at that time, because it was in the rock, unseen and not accessible. They reached this place, not down here. They reached the upper rim of this pool and threw down their buckets and ropes and drew water from this spot. We came with our empty buckets from there, from the tunnel in between the two walls. And here is actually the place where there was a wooden platform above this deep part of what we call the pool. And here, people were standing on that platform. You can still see here this incision in the rock where the wooden platform was inserted. They threw down the buckets, drew water which accumulated at the bottom of this very deep cutting, the so-called pool, drew water and went back to town.
So, second, just stop that. Now let's get this back. So we get back to this image here, and this is the termination point where the tunnel ends up at this point. Now, when King David arrived here in this city, there was very a small population, but of Jebusites. Essentially, the Jebusite king and his tribe lived on this mountain, and they were the first ones to move water into the city at this industrial scale to support their growing population. Now, because King David had to attack the city, he stayed in Hebron for 7 years before he came to attack the city. Before that, we tried on numerous occasions during the time of Joshua to come back and attack Jerusalem and take Jerusalem back. There was something compelling about Jerusalem that made King David choose to come here after 7 years being king in Hebron, to come and base his kingdom here and unite all of the tribes of Israel from this point. This was the only point he knew that he could do that from. So something on this mountain was compelling King David to be here. But in order for him to conquer the mountain, to take over the leadership on the mountain, he had to do one thing. He had to take control of the water. Now, if the town at the top of the mountain relies on this water, industrial scale water distribution taking place through this tunnel, where would you attack this town? So King David says to all of his men, whoever gets in, penetrates this mountain, and takes control of the mountain will become my general. And what happens is that his men come here at night, they come down through this valley, they creep in through this Gihon spring openings in the side of the mountain. They climb up through the tunnel systems in the mountain, and Yoav climbs up this, which was called the Tzinor. If you look in Tanakh, you'll see the references to Tzinor. Nobody knew what Tzinor means. It means a pipe. And Yoav climbs up that pipe, enters the industrial distribution system, takes control of the tunnels that were used to move water in and up into the city, and that was it. Once we had control of the water, we owned the city. And so from there, King David negotiates with the king of the Jebusites to essentially continue to own and occupy the city, because he has leverage over the water. That's what enabled King David to effectively come into the city. But we know by the end of King David's life, okay, it's not that he evicted the Jebusites from the city. The Jebusite king at the end of King David's life is still living in the city. King David buys the Temple Mount. He buys the threshing floor from the Jebusite king, and ultimately locates the first temple, the plans of the first temple, for his son, King Solomon, to build up on the Temple Mount. And that's actually what unified all of the tribes of Israel. It was really around King David's actions, which followed a whole series of disasters, plagues, the death of 70,000 Israelites up in the north of Israel, pandemonium, that they all decided, okay, we're in. We're going to buy the Temple Mount from the Jebusite king. We're all going to put money in. All of the tribes did that, and they bought the land from the Jebusite king at the top of the mountain. This is the pool at the bottom that Ronnie was talking about. Now, here is the same pool area, this yellow rectangle. This is an image of the pool. This is the southern wall of the city at the top of the Temple Mount, the Kidron Valley here. And now, if you look here, this is the round, what we call the round chamber, which is where the water was drawn from. There was a wooden platform built into this incision here in the rock in this area that was suspended over this entire pool. This is where they were drawing up water every single day from the pool, bottling it, storing it on the wooden platform, and next day moving it up into the city. Now, we know so much about this from one discovery, okay, and that's the boulders that you see here lying on the bedrock were trapped underneath them 2 layers of ruins that timestamp the time that those ruins existed. So we have what's called strata 10 layers, which is the Bronze Age layers going back to the Jebusite period and before Abram, Isaac, Jacob, that period of time. And then we have a layer 7, okay, missing layers 8 and 9. So something happened under these boulders when they were trapped in the Babylonian destruction that essentially showed us that 8 and 9 were missing. Something must have been protecting any debris falling on the bedrock here between 10 and 7, and that was this wooden platform that stopped any 8 and 9 layers of debris falling. Of course, when the destruction of the temple happened in layers in 7, strata 7, that's when these boulders were trapping both those layers. So we now know where the missing time is from, and we can tell that from the archaeology how this story evolved. I'm now going to take you back to 2009. This is where I became involved in these excavations on the eastern slope, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of what is arguably the most important and certainly the oldest and certainly the most controversial discovery that's occurred on the mountain of Moriah. I think it's this video that's a little quiet, so.
Connected with the history.
what is now being revealed is part of our revelation of the truth in this world, the truth of history, the truth of this place, that this is a place that is associated with Jewish history for 3,500 years or more. This is Eli Shukran, this is the founder of David, with his partner Yehuda, who came very shortly after David to Ir David. So, one second. Now, when we discovered this in 2009, we hadn't really discovered what I'm about to show you. We only discovered what I'm about to show you in 2011. But in order to get down to the layers of the bedrock, we had to really retain about 20 million cubic feet of dirt, which was about to slide down the mountain into the area that we wanted to excavate. So we needed to build a 30-meter retainer wall by about 12 meters high in order to retain all of this mountain that wanted to slide down into the excavation area. And we had to use these anchor bolts to actually go down about 10 meters into the earth and into a bedrock to anchor the wall to the bedrock. And every time we needed to go into the earth, we had to stop every 30 centimeters that the drill went in and inspect that we weren't damaging some artifacts so it took 6 years to build this wall. I mean, all we did for 5 or 6 years was basically build a wall. And as we built this wall, we kept going down and down and down through the earlier dirt layers until we ultimately hit the bedrock. Now, this is what the city may have looked like about 3,300 years ago, thereabouts, something around the time of Joshua, the time that Israel rose up out of Egypt, which we're learning about now, we're reading now in these parashot, and of course Pesach coming up. This is the story of our exodus from Egypt. But when Joshua arrives here 3,300 years ago roughly, this is what the city may have looked like. Okay? Clearly this double wall structure, the structure over the Gihon spring, had been built to protect the city or to protect the distribution of water into their city. That was valuable to them, and they knew that Israel was rising up out of Egypt. They knew Israel was coming back here. They knew that this was going to be the place that Israel wanted to be located. And so
who built that double structure?
This was built by this structure that you see here. Yes. So this was built by the Jebusites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, the Canaanite kings in the area. It was clearly not built by the population that lived there, where there's not enough people to build it. They needed support from their regional allies in order to build such a structure, and they all knew that Israel was rising. And they all knew that Israel was coming back here. So here we have that cave house that I'll show you. Here at the bottom we have a pool. My interest is in the rectangular area, okay, the black box. And in fact, my particular interest is up at the top section here, which is where the excavation, the wall, has helped us to reveal the bedrock. And you can see that this is where the pool is, down the bottom that Ronnie was talking about earlier on. And I'm going to show you here this discovery, which is arguably the most fascinating and important discovery. It's certainly the oldest discovery on the mountain, and it really has, and we're still learning about it. We really don't know exactly how to position it. So the archaeologists have some views, the scholars have some views. There's a lot of variation in this at this point in time. The 4 rooms that are located there are detailed as follows. From the northern side, there is an oil press. It's not an ordinary production oil press. It's an oil press which was used only to make pure oil. You have to take the press, a single press, and take the oil out. It was used for sacrificial purposes. Okay. Next to it, you have a raised platform, and you can see at the top section over here this liquids channel that runs from the raised platform here. These rooms are all constructed out of bedrock, so they're not bricks built on the bedrock. They're carved out of the entire bedrock. These walls here are bedrock walls. So whoever constructed this room constructed it purposefully to leave this raised platform in that place. We know that raised platform to be a shtia, a foundation stone, an even hashtia. A shtia is a requirement of a mizbeach. It's a platform for a mizbeach to be built, and this is where an altar existed at some point in time in the past. So we have grain press, which was used again for flour, for refining flour, for offering with sacrifices, which we know about through all the laws that we learn of sacrifices: oil, grain, wine, of course, and animals, which we see here. Probably suspended some boards which were used to open the animal after it was slaughtered, remove the white fats from around the diaphragm, and to use those fats as the tamid offering, which was offered every day on the altar. And then we have this fascinating discovery over here, a matzeva. Now this discovery is the one that baffles all of us, because we know that the matzeva is about this high, about 40, 50 centimeters high off the ground. It's a single stone surrounded by 12 stones. The stone, we don't know where it came from. It's the only one in Israel that exists. There is no body buried on this bedrock anywhere near it. It was a proper matzeva, which we learn about from Bereshit, from Jacob, the story of Jacob, who had a dream about a ladder, and he slept on. He put 12 stones around him. They became one stone that night. And he took that stone and he anointed it and made a covenant with God that if God brought him back to this place, he would call that place Beit El. He would build a temple. He would build Beit El, a temple to God. And we know that's what a matzeva was used. But by the time Joshua came here, which was after Torah had been given, there was a prohibition for the use of matzevot for the purpose of praying to Hashem. So after Avot, after the fathers, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and by the time we get to Moses, there is a prohibition, a very clear prohibition in Jewish law against the use of matzevot, of a matzeva. So we think this area goes back a very long time, to certainly beyond Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, probably to Noah's son Shem, Melchizedek, the high priest of Shalem. We think that this is the temple that existed on the mountain before any of the first or the second temple existed, and we see that that this area, having been used most likely by Shem, Melchizedek, and to whom Abram tithed his wealth, existed on the eastern slope of that mountain, close to the water source, before the development of the populations up on the top of the mountain. So we're left with a big enigma that we have to resolve. And it's a very important issue to resolve because we know in Jewish law that a temple cannot be rebuilt unless we know where the place of the Mizbeach, of the altar, is. And we know that the Mizbeach from the first and the second temples were up on the Temple Mount. But there's a big issue in reading the interpretations of Jewish law, particularly Rambam, who says that the Mizbeach is in a very specific location, and it's always been in that location, and it's never been in any other location. He doesn't say exactly that the location is where it was on the first and second temple, He just says Akedah is that location. It's essentially where Isaac was offered as a sacrifice. We don't know where Isaac was offered as a sacrifice, on the mountain, somewhere on the mountain. Certainly the first and second temples that were destroyed up at the top of the mountain had a mizbeach there at the top of the mountain, and we now find this that existed before the first and second temples, and it opens up a whole can of worms. A lot of questions, a lot of issues, a lot of points to discover, a lot of contextual points, and so many sources in Bereshit, and the story of Jacob, the story of Abram, the story of Shem, the story of Joshua, the story of Yoshiyahu, one of the last kings of Israel, who removed all of the idolatry from the temple and burned it in the Kidron Valley and had the ashes delivered into Beit El. Now, the controversy comes because in the north of Jerusalem is modern Beit El. And modern Beit El is 10 kilometers north of Jerusalem. But if you look at this map here and you swap the name Jerusalem on the south with Jacob's Beit El, okay, then you would have a Beit El in the south and a Beit El in the north, which is where modern Beit El is today. Now, the northern boundary of Benjamin sits with Ephraim, the tribe of Ephraim, and the southern boundary sits with the tribe of Yehudah. So when David moved the temple site through his planning, and Solomon built the temple site, he built it on the southern boundary of Benjamin with Yehudah, as opposed to the Mishkan that came out of the desert, that came with us from Egypt. The Mishkan was built in the tribe of Ephraim's territory in a place called Shiloh. So the value to a tribe of a temple is economic, it's competitive, and clearly there was a lot of competition amongst our tribes. And Solomon's son Rehoboam basically capitulated to a king of the northern tribes whose name was Jeroboam. And in the time immediately after King Solomon died, there was a massive conflict between Rehoboam and Jeroboam. Jeroboam built in Beit El on the boundary of Ephraim a temple of idolatry. He stopped all the 10 tribes of Israel from the north coming to Jerusalem, and he propagated and permeated this idea of the temple of idolatry. These are your gods, the same way that the Chet HaEgel, the golden calf, was the gods of Israel in Egypt. He essentially returned Israel to idolatry in the northern Beit El, and we forgot all about the southern Beit El, and we have never been unified as a nation ever since that period of time. So we now find ourselves back here at the times of Mashiach, and our objective is to try and unlock this mystery and to try and come to some decisions about where we will actually build a temple, and to get that process with the coming of Mashiach underway as quickly as we possibly can.
Amen.
So with that, I thank you all for coming tonight, and I'd be very, very happy to take some questions. Sure.
Kevin, thank you. I was thinking about Parkway and the guy before him, how their system of excavation was tunneling.
Yes.
And that was their primary methodology. Today it's one I guess we use least to do that kind of tunneling. Unless we come tunneling through, we come across places like Gotha, right, and we have to go around them. Fine. And when we look at what's above the steps going up to the temple, this massive infrastructure with stainless steel and girders and incredibly modern and good. Yet the people above are saying, the local residents are saying that their homes are perhaps being damaged. That may just be political. But my question then is, how sure are we that our methodology today is so good that we're not missing out things? I heard what you said about every 40 centimeters stopping and checking. But are we racing through this excavation too quickly? That we may be missing?
Well, I mean, I think, look, my experience is that they are extremely thorough. So every single packet of dirt, essentially, every time they dig, they take dirt from the site that they dig, fill it up into Hessian bags, move the Hessian bags off to sifting sites. The bags are marked, they know exactly where the locations are from, and they sift on the Temple Mount sifting operation, which is up in Mount of Olives, through all these sites. Most of these seals that I showed you up here have not been found on location. They've been found in the subsequent sifting operations that occur after some later point in time that date back, that they can trace back to the point. So, look, I mean, I think that certainly the earlier excavations of Parker and Duncan and Warren were much less precise than we are today, much less precise. We're discovering, I think, as much as we possibly can.
Okay, I think the amazing thing is some of the seals that you mentioned before corroborate
Exactly
with
same names.
in Tanakh, which is
I can tell you there are seals that have not yet been revealed because they're still trying to figure out exactly who they are and what they are. But it's an absolute no-brainer. You know, there are so many of them. There's hundreds of seals. So
how do the seals themselves survive? Because they're not.
Well, they survived fire because they were hardened in fire, because that's what pottery does. You put pottery in a kiln, it hardens. In the kiln, when there's fire, it hardens even more. So those seals survived.
There's remnants of the fire there when the Babylonians came and...
Oh yeah, there's lots of remnants. There's lots of remnants because basically the stone walls fell, but the wooden beams that were above the stone walls burned and they fell into the dirt and the destruction, and you can still see those ash layers today. And we excavate all those ash layers and we know exactly how they date. So yeah.
That's probably a bit more for Gourarie, but how do we understand the spirituality in the Hebrew letters that we have in our Torah, which we know dates at least back to Dead Sea Scrolls, etc. With obviously the Hebrew letters, ancient Hebrew letters that the seals were written in were a completely different script. So how do we understand that change in Hebrew letters and how it relates to the Torah that we have?
So first of all, first I want to expert in that area, but you also have to understand that just like today we have what we call Ksava Shuris, which is the font we use in the Sefer Torah.
Yeah.
Right? And then we have the way we write the letters. There's a Sefer Torah that was around, that goes, I don't know where it is now, but there's a Sefer Torah that was discovered a number of years ago that dated back to the time of Ezra, which is the beginning of the second Mishnah, which was very similar to our Sefer Torah. So the letters that they wrote and the stuff that they would write are using fonts that not necessarily with the letters of the Sefer Torah.
Yeah.
And just like we have script and we have different letters, labels, and different letters.
Yeah, I mean, I've looked at this extensively, and I think that the best analogy to look at is how firstly writing in the period we're talking about 3,000 years ago, or that period 3,300 years ago, there were very few people who actually wrote. Very, very few people. And there wasn't paper around that people wrote on. They didn't teach kids to write in school. There was you were a scribe. Moses was a scribe in Pharaoh's palace, and he was one of the exclusive, unique, academics who was really taught how to write. And so we have these the writing forms. You could imagine as cursive writing, just sort of rough writing. But there were very, very, very few people who could actually write in any formal style. It took a long time to structure writing in a formal style. Ezra was clearly Ezra HaSofer. Ezra the scribe in Babylon really was the sort of first to change, to introduce a law that stopped any further writing in the previous cursive scripts that existed from the origins of our writing practices. And at that point in time, we moved away from the historical scripts to the script that we all know today?
Can I just mention something that you didn't mention, but you got asked about accuracy? One of the things that I just discovered that James showed us, they know now what King David's palace was, right? And one of the ways they know, and one of the fascinating things is there's a piece of artwork there which comes from Tyre, which was very out of character for you normally find Israel. As a result, in Canaanite times, under the influence of Egypt, most artifacts they found was more Egyptian style. If you look at the Pasuk, where King David becomes king and he becomes prominent in power, the king of Tsur sent him presents, and it's right there in the spot where his palace is. It's absolutely
Absolutely, yeah. It's the Phoenicians.
that little thing. It's amazing.
Good, thank you very much. Thank you.
Just amazing. Thank you so much, Kevin. I just want to mention two things. First of all, part of what happened tonight also has to do with, as you know, I'm sure most of you have seen the BINA calendar that came out this year. We put the calendar out every year with a different theme. Mrs. Letterman is very involved in the calendar, and this year, together with Yaakov and the whole office staff. Oh, here we are. Thank you. And this year we decided that the theme on the pages would be verses from Tehillim, from Psalms, and we thought, what better way to put verses of Psalms with lessons, to put it with pictures of the place where Tehillim was written, which is the city of David. So I contacted Kevin. In fact, I met him in the middle of the street because he's hard to get hold of. So the only way to meet him is actually in the middle of the street.
When something that happens like that, you know it's meant to.
And I said, we really want to do something with David. He said, send me an email. Within days, we had 70, 80, 90 pictures or something from David. We chose 12. They sent us high resolution. That's everyone's saying it's the most beautiful calendar we ever had. So thank you so much. So it's all pictures from David with a little bit of explanation. Thank you so much, Kevin. Amazing. The only thing Kevin and me disagree is about that place in the Mizbeach, because I think the Rambam is saying something different. Actually, James gave me a good explanation when I was there. Otherwise, it's absolutely fascinating. Those who are not on the BINA email system, and we have a lot coming up this term, it's fascinating, exciting stuff. Please see Mrs. Letterman. She'll take your details, put you on the email system, so you'll be up to date with all that BINA is doing on all different levels, amazing different activities, very diverse program. So please give us your email so we can keep you up to date. Thank you very much again. Lots of atzlacha with the excavations, and keep revealing stuff on our history. And we're all waiting for Mashiach, where